the opposition said that it got more than 8 million votes, which would be more than what Chavez got in 2012. Does this number make any sense to you?
Well, it's interesting. So before the election took place on Chavez's birthday, which, I think is a little unfair to the opposition, but it's another day in the year. So before this date, the ambassadors from various Latin American countries were calling up the government officials with whom they had contact. So, for instance, one of them kept calling a vice minister who runs Latin America on behalf of the Venezuelan foreign ministry and asking them, when will the actas or the polling papers be released? This is weird because nobody's ever asked this question before. And actas are not released. There's Venezuelan procedure and laws. I went and looked at it. In fact, there's a procedure which we could get into the weeds of this if you want. It's not that interesting. But generally, polling documents are not released online. What you get is tabulations. I mean, let's say, you're in Belgium. Belgium has an election. Do they release every polling station's document which shows how many people there were, who voted for what? And in fact, going down to really who in this house voted for which candidate. I mean, it's a violation of the secrecy of elections. It's a weird question. Okay, so there was all this happening before the election on the 20th of July. Now, just a few days before the 20th, a poll was released. Now, there were many polls actually released. Right-wing newspapers, and people should know that Venezuela has most of the media is right of center. Right-wing newspapers were doing these polls on Twitter, super reliable, right? Asking their followers, who are you going to vote for? Well, everybody knows those polls are junk. Polling, in fact, is not a science in Venezuela. There really isn't a reputable polling agency or anything. Well, the poll that was being referred to by everybody, including Maria Corina Machado, Edmundo Gonzalez, the newspapers in the United States, and so on, the poll was done by a group called Edison Research, which is based in New Jersey, Edison Research. Now, if you go to their website, there's two things of note about Edison Research. Number one thing of note is that Edison Research does a lot of polls and other kind of things for CIA contractors. For instance, Radio Free Europe, this, that, the other. I mean, it's a very interesting list. They only seem to do research for CIA contractors. That's one interesting thing. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't decide to do this poll for somebody else. I just don't know. I would like to know who was their client that asked them to do this poll. Separate question. Maybe Frank Barat should call up Edison Research and say, hello, I'm doing a story. Who was your client? Seems like nobody has asked them. In fact, I tried to ring them. Didn't get an answer. Interesting. Phone was not picked up by anybody. Does anybody exist at the other end? I don't know. Second interesting thing when you visit their website is you'll find the poll. It's there. Now, I mean, I'm not a psephologist. I don't do a lot of polling. I do read data, but I don't do or make data. But I have a general idea from being a social scientist what data is like. When you go to their poll, they just have the result. They say that the opposition is going to win 70%, the Chavistas around 30%. What they don't have is methodology. They don't have any sense of the sample. Was it nationwide? Was it conducted by the telephone? Who did the polling? There's no information. In other words, it's merely the result, no methodology. This is highly suspicious. And they said 70% to the opposition. Now, if I asked even the most, hardcore opposition person privately, like, do you think you'd get 70%? I very much doubt that they would agree to the 70% number. And you are very correct to raise this question. Like, would they have got more votes than Chavez got in 2012? It's very unlikely. Of course, there was an anti-socialist, anti-Maduro vote that existed. But it's very unlikely that that vote would have gone 25% of the electorate was voting against the government. I doubt it very much. And there's a couple of reasons why I doubt it. One, the safe hands of the opposition, in other words, the more credible people, privately say to you that, look, we couldn't break the 50% barrier. Secondly, in the marches and demonstrations after the election, it was pretty clear that the marches and demonstrations done by Maria Corina Machado, and there were many of them, most of the people on the streets for her were middle class. There was some working class presence, but it was not significant working class presence to indicate that there was a change of mood. And at the pro Maduro rallies, there was a vast working class presence. Now, working class protests are always smaller than middle class protests, principally because it's harder to get there. You don't have vehicles, public transport is not always available, and so on. Nonetheless, the next day, the day after the election, there were thousands of people marching down the street almost spontaneously. Even though the opposition was conducting acts of violence, motorcycles driving here and there, smashing things up, and so on, the government side didn't conduct violence. I mean, there were arrests, and I'm sure we'll talk about that, but that's different from the kind of random violence of throwing things around. I was staying in a hotel where there were a number of election observers, and there were opposition motorcycles sitting opposite very threateningly, as if they were going to come in and start, roughing up. I mean, there were election observers at the election, the CNE, which is their Council for Elections, and they were surrounded by opposition gang wanting to beat them up. I mean, it was a tough bunch of days. So, yeah, yes, there was a poll. Yes, 70% to the opposition. Yes, that seemed entirely the tricks that I've seen many times from Langley, much less from, the people of Venezuela.
So, what is US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken talking about when he said very quickly, a few days after the election, that there was overwhelming evidence that Gonzalez won? What evidence was he talking about? And in a way, I'll put the other question right next to it. And historically, why does the US seems to be so interested in Venezuela? Are they like neutral observer in the region?
Well, let's go to the evidence. So, look, every country has its procedures. Now, you can debate the procedures. Venezuela, there's a procedure. There's electoral council. They have their own set of things that they do. You can actually go to the council as a political party and make an appeal. Other parties did, not the opposition. They decided not to. The Socialist Party went and they presented their evidence, and that was an internal review by the election body. Now, when there was more questions asked, Mr. Maduro personally went on behalf of the Socialist Party to the Supreme Court of Venezuela and asked for an investigation. The opposition decided to boycott the court. Now, I understand the Chavistas have been in power since 1998. I understand that. The Supreme Court, is basically mainly nominated by the Chavistas. It's going to have an orientation like that. I understand that. But if you look at the biography of the judges, they've all had a career that spans from before the Chavez movement takes power. These are people with long histories. They are not, sort of activists who are on the court. These are jurists. Okay, and then they eventually looked at the evidence. By the way, the opposition boycotted it. They looked at the evidence and they said, well, the election looks fine, and they certified it for Mr. Maduro. Now, for the United States to talk about elections and the Supreme Court is extraordinary, because you may remember there was a court case, Bush versus Gore, where George Bush was running against Al Gore. The election was tied up around Florida, and rather than allow the US people to decide, the US Supreme Court picked the winner. So it's a bit rum for United States to say, why is the court getting involved? Oh my God, the US Supreme Court has gotten involved in elections more than that one occasion.